She thought the worst part of her sister's wedding would be seeing her ex-boyfriend again. She was wrong. But the dangerous stranger who stepped from the shadows wasn't a hero. He was the most feared man in Italy, and his 3 words, "Don't touch her again," weren't a rescue. They were a claim. The champagne flute felt like ice against Isabella's clammy palm. Bubbles raced to the surface of the golden liquid, a frantic, silent scream that mirrored the panic rising in her own chest. She was home. The thought was a stone in her stomach. Naples. A city of ghosts dressed in wedding attire. Around her, the grand ballroom of the Villa d'Oro pulsed with life. Laughter cascaded like the crystal from the chandeliers. The scent of 1,000 white lilies and Sorrento lemons hung thick in the air, and a string quartet played Vivaldi with a passion that felt like a personal mockery of her own numb heart. It was her sister's wedding. Sophia, her beautiful, naive little sister, was now a wife. Isabella watched her across the shimmering dance floor, a vision in white lace, her smile so bright it could have lit the entire Bay of Naples. A genuine smile, the kind Isabella couldn't remember how to form anymore. She took a nervous sip of Prosecco, the crisp taste doing nothing to soothe the raw edges of her nerves. She shouldn't have come back. 5 years. 5 years she had spent in Milan, carefully building a new life on the rubble of the old one, brick by painful brick. She had a small apartment, a job as a graphic designer that she loved, and friends who knew nothing of the girl she used to be. The girl who had her heart and her pride shattered in the middle of the Piazza del Plebiscito for everyone to see. Her father caught her eye, raising his glass in a toast. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper than she remembered, etched not just by age but by a worry he tried to hide behind a jovial host's smile. He was happy for Sophia, but something was amiss. Isabella could feel it, a low hum of anxiety beneath the celebration's joyful symphony. She had felt it the moment she'd stepped back into their family home, a tension that had nothing to do with wedding planning. Isabella forced a smile back at him, the gesture feeling alien on her face. Her gaze drifted, scanning the crowd of unfamiliar faces and... oh God. No. Her breath hitched. The glass in her hand trembled, threatening to slip. There he was, Marco Bianchi. He stood near the grand entrance, leaning against a marble column as if he owned it. He was exactly as she remembered, yet worse. His tailored suit was impossibly sharp, his dark hair perfectly styled, and his smile, that lazy, arrogant smirk that promised the world and delivered only ruin. It was the same smile that had charmed her, captivated her, and then gutted her. Time hadn't humbled him. It had only sharpened his cruelty, polished his confidence into a weapon. Why was he here? Who would invite him? Her blood ran cold. He wasn't just a guest. He was a statement. A reminder that no matter how far she ran, her past had an unbreakable leash. Their eyes met across the crowded room. The music seemed to fade into a dull roar in her ears. His smirk widened, a glint of cruel victory in his eyes. He knew. He knew the effect he still had on her, the way her carefully constructed walls crumbled to dust under his gaze. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up her throat. She had to leave. Now. She could slip out, tell Sophia she felt ill. It would be rude, it would be cowardly, but it would be safe. Safety was a luxury she hadn't realized she cherished until this very moment. She turned, her body stiff, ready to bolt. But it was too late. He was already moving. He pushed off the column with a liquid grace she despised, weaving through the laughing guests with the predatory ease of a shark navigating a coral reef. Every step he took toward her was a drumbeat of doom against her ribs. 1 step. 2. The ballroom began to shrink, the walls closing in, the air growing thin and heavy. People became blurs of silk and velvet, their happy chatter a meaningless buzz. There was only him, a dark specter from a life she'd fought so hard to escape, coming to drag her back into the nightmare. His shadow stretched long and thin in the golden light. And then... it fell over her.
From the shadowed seclusion of a private balcony, Alessandro De Luca watched the celebration below. He did not belong here. This world of forced smiles, fragile alliances, and fleeting joy was a foreign country. His world was one of shadows, of debts paid in whispers and loyalty sealed in blood. He was here for a single reason: to ensure Signore Romano, the bride's father, remembered the delicate nature of their recent arrangement. A business matter, nothing more. Alessandro did not do pleasure. He did not do weddings. He did, however, command respect, and his silent presence was a more potent reminder of that than any spoken threat. His eyes, dark and discerning, swept over the scene. He saw the nervous sweat on Romano's brow, the calculated warmth in the groom's handshake, the quiet desperation in the eyes of men who had leveraged too much on the success of this union. He saw everything. It was his gift and his curse. His consigliere, Luca, stood a few feet behind him, a silent statue of loyalty, his presence as familiar and reliable as the weight of the signet ring on Alessandro's finger. "Gallo's men are at the south entrance," Luca murmured, his voice a low rumble that didn't carry past Alessandro's ear. "Just watching." "Let them watch," Alessandro replied, his gaze never leaving the floor. Riccardo Gallo was a rival, a serpent who mistook patience for weakness. He would learn his error soon enough. But Gallo was not the focus of Alessandro's attention tonight. She was Isabella Romano. He'd recognized her the instant she'd walked in. 5 years had passed since he'd last seen her, yet the memory was as clear as the view through the crisp evening air. It had been a chance encounter at a small cafe. He'd been concluding a tense negotiation when a sudden downpour had started. She had rushed in, laughing, rain-soaked and vibrant, and had offered him her small umbrella without a second thought when she saw him standing under the inadequate awning. He, the man people crossed the street to avoid, had been offered a simple, uncalculated kindness. He had refused, of course, but the memory of her bright, guileless eyes had lodged itself in his mind, a single shard of light in his monochromatic world. Tonight, that light was gone. He watched her by the champagne fountain, a ghost at the feast. She held her glass in a white-knuckled grip, her posture a fortress of anxiety. There was a fragile strength about her, a quiet defiance in the set of her jaw that fascinated him. She was a woman trying desperately not to break while the world did its best to shatter her. He saw her father toast her, saw the strained smile she returned, and he saw the moment her eyes found the man by the column. Alessandro's entire body went still. Marco Bianchi, a low-level parasite with a bloated ego and connections to Gallo's filthier operations. Alessandro knew of him, knew of his reputation, a predator who enjoyed preying on those he perceived as weaker. When Isabella had fled Naples 5 years ago, whispers had followed her, whispers of a brutal public humiliation at Bianchi's hand. Alessandro had dismissed it as idle gossip then. Now, seeing the raw terror that washed over her face, he knew it was all true. Every protective instinct he had spent a lifetime suppressing roared to life. It was an illogical, dangerous, and utterly consuming urge. He felt a cold, possessive fury coil in his gut, a fury that had no place in a business transaction. His hand tightened on the marble balustrade, the stone cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the heat building inside him. What was this? This feeling, this primal need to shield her from that man's poisonous gaze. He watched Bianchi begin his slow, deliberate walk across the room. The man moved with the unearned confidence of a bully, enjoying the fear he was creating. Each step was an insult, each smirk a violation. Alessandro tracked his progress, his mind a razor-sharp calculator of distances and angles. He saw Isabella's desperate urge to flee, the way she was frozen in place, a rabbit caught in the unblinking stare of a viper. He should stay here. He should remain in the shadows. His presence on the floor would cause a scene, draw unwanted attention, and complicate his business with her father. It was the smart move, the logical move. the only move for a man in his position. But then he saw the flicker of sheer, soul-deep despair in her eyes as Marco's shadow finally enveloped her. And in that instant, logic burned away, leaving only a cold, hard certainty. He pushed away from the balustrade. "Luca," he said, his voice a low, lethal command. "Stay here." He would not let that man lay a hand on her. He would not let that shadow touch her again. He began his descent into the light, a king leaving his castle not for diplomacy, but for war.
Isabella. His voice slid over her name like oil, slick and suffocating. It was the same tone he used to use right before he broke her down, piece by piece. "Look at you. You came back." Marco's eyes roamed over her, a slow, insolent appraisal that made her skin crawl, making her feel stripped bare right in the middle of her sister's wedding. "I have to admit, I was surprised. I didn't think you had the courage." Courage. The word was a joke coming from him. He thought her running away was cowardice. He had no idea that it was the single bravest thing she had ever done. Her throat was tight, her lungs burning for air that wouldn't come. The scent of his cologne, a cloying citrus scent she once loved, now smelled like decay. It wrapped around her, pulling her back through time, back to a sun-drenched piazza and the worst day of her life. The cobblestones of the Piazza del Plebiscito were hot, radiating the brutal afternoon sun. Tourists milled about, their cameras clicking, their laughter echoing in the vast open space. Isabella had been laughing too, just moments before. Marco had surprised her with gelato, her favorite, pistachio and dark chocolate. She'd felt so in love, so cherished. But then she'd mentioned her acceptance letter. A semester abroad in Milan, a dream she'd nurtured for years. His smile had vanished. It didn't just disappear, it was wiped away, replaced by a cold, flat emptiness that terrified her. "Milan?" he'd said, the word a drop of ice. "You aren't going anywhere." "It's just for a few months, Marco," she'd pleaded, her voice small. "It's for my design portfolio. It's important." "More important than me?" He'd tossed his barely touched gelato into a nearby bin with a flick of his wrist. The gesture was so dismissive, so full of contempt, it made her flinch. "You think you can just leave? That you're better than this? Better than me?" He began to raise his voice. People were starting to look. A German couple lowered their camera. A group of teenagers paused their chatter. "Please," she'd whispered, her face burning with shame. "Marco, don't do this here." But he wanted an audience. He thrived on it. "This girl," he announced to the curious onlookers, his voice booming across the stones, "thinks she is too good for Naples, too good for the man who gave her everything." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. He wasn't just holding her, he was branding her. "She is nothing without me, a scared little girl who pretends to be an artist. You want to go to Milan so badly? Go. But don't you dare come crawling back when you fail. Because you will fail. You are nothing." He'd let go of her then, shoving her slightly. She'd stumbled, catching herself before she fell. And he just stood there, watching her with dead eyes as the weight of 100 strangers' pitying stares crushed her. He hadn't laid a hand on her, not really. He hadn't needed to. He had flayed her soul with his words, leaving her exposed and bleeding in the center of the world. That was the girl he saw when he looked at her now. The broken, humiliated creature he had created. That was her deepest, darkest fear. That he was right. That deep down, she was still that girl. Her desire, the one that had fueled every lonely night and every hard-won success in Milan, was to prove him wrong. To stand on her own 2 feet and look him in the eye without flinching. To be so whole that his poison couldn't find a single crack to seep into. She drew in a shaky breath, the memory receding like a foul tide. She saw her sister Sophia again, now chatting with their aunt, her expression one of pure, unadulterated happiness. Sophia didn't know the whole truth of that day. Isabella had protected her from it, had downplayed it as just a bad breakup. How could she tarnish her sister's perfect day with that ugliness? The stakes were not just her own pride anymore. They were Sophia's joy, her family's peace. She had to handle this. She had to be strong for them. Across the room, her father was in a hushed, intense conversation with two grim-faced men. He ran a hand over his face, his party smile completely gone, replaced by a mask of raw stress. That was the hum of anxiety she'd felt. It was real. Her family was in some kind of trouble, and this monster in front of her was somehow connected to it all. She could feel it. His presence here wasn't a coincidence. "What do you want, Marco?" she asked, her voice quiet but steadier than she expected. She lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his gaze. She would not let him see her tremble.
Alessandro moved like smoke. The joyous crowd parted before him, a subconscious reaction to the cold authority that radiated from him in waves. They didn't know who he was, not exactly, but they knew he was not one of them. He was a wolf in a field of sheep, and his eyes were fixed on his prey. Or rather, on the lesser predator foolish enough to corner a creature Alessandro had, for reasons he was still processing, decided was his to protect. His mind was a maelstrom of ice and fire. This visceral, white-hot rage was an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 15 years. Not since the night he'd come home to the scent of his mother's ruined roses and the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder. He'd been just a boy, but the memory was seared into his soul. The image of his mother, lifeless in the garden, a victim of a rival's cowardice. The sight of his father, the most powerful man he knew, utterly broken. That night, Alessandro had buried the boy he was and become the man he needed to be. A man who felt nothing. A man for whom vulnerability was a fatal disease. He built walls of stone and ice around his heart, his only motivation the preservation of the De Luca name, the absolute protection of what little family he had left. Weakness invited attack. Emotion was weakness. This was the code he lived by, and Isabella Romano was cracking that code with every terrified beat of her heart. He saw the way Marco Bianchi spoke to her, his lips moving with a smug cruelty. He saw the way Isabella flinched, her eyes clouding over with a past trauma so vivid it was like a physical shadow. He saw her glance at her sister, then at her father, and he understood. Her fear wasn't just for herself. Her stakes were family. It was a language Alessandro understood perfectly. Luca appeared at his elbow, a ghost in a tuxedo. "Boss?" he questioned, his voice a low note of concern. He had disobeyed. Good. It meant Luca knew the rules could be broken when the stakes were high enough. "Wait," Alessandro commanded, his eyes locked on the scene. He needed to see. He needed to know what she would do. He remembered the girl in the cafe, the one who offered him her umbrella. She hadn't known who he was. She hadn't seen the darkness clinging to him, the blood on his family's ledger. She had just seen a man in the rain. That simple human gesture had been a profound anomaly in his life, a life built on transactions, leverage, and fear. Her spirit, untainted and bright, had captivated him. He saw that same spirit now, buried under layers of fear, fighting its way to the surface. He saw her spine straighten. He saw her chin lift. He saw the flicker of fire return to her eyes. She was not just a victim. She was a survivor. And in that moment, his cold, calculated mission to protect a business asset transformed into something fiercely personal. Marco Bianchi wasn't just insulting a debtor's daughter. He was desecrating something rare, something Alessandro had, without ever admitting it to himself, already claimed in his mind. He was only a few yards away now. He could see the faint tremor in her hand, the defiant set of her jaw. He could smell the cheap citrus of Bianchi's cologne, an offensive scent in the otherwise elegant room. He slowed his steps, a predator pausing before the final strike. He would let this play out for one more second. He would give her the chance to fight her own battle. But he was here. He was the final word, the inevitable conclusion. And Marco Bianchi was about to learn that some things, once touched, belonged to a world of consequences he couldn't possibly imagine.
Marco's lips twisted into a cruel smile, a caricature of the charm she had once fallen for. He leaned in closer, his voice a low, possessive murmur meant only for her. "What do I want?" he purred, his eyes dropping to her mouth. "I want what's mine, Isabella. You ran off to Milan to play artist, but you can't escape what you are. What we are. You belong here, with me." The sheer arrogance of his words was a slap in itself. He thought he could just reappear after 5 years and reclaim her, as if she were a piece of property he'd misplaced. The fear that had been strangling her moments before began to burn, the edges curling up into something new, something hot and sharp. Anger. Pure, undiluted rage. "I don't belong to you, Marco," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. She could feel people watching them, could feel the curious glances turning their way. Let them watch. She wasn't that girl in the piazza anymore. "I don't belong to anyone, and the only thing we are is a mistake I corrected 5 years ago." He actually laughed, a short, ugly sound. He reached out and grabbed her elbow, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't be dramatic, Tesoro. We have unfinished business. You embarrassed me when you left. We're going to go somewhere quiet and talk about how you're going to make it up to me." He started to pull her toward the French doors that led to the gardens. Panic flared again, but the anger was stronger. It was a shield. It was a weapon. She planted her feet, yanking her arm back with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The move was so sudden it made him stumble a step. "There is nothing to talk about," she said, her voice rising, clear and cold. It cut through the nearby chatter. A small bubble of silence began to form around them. "There is no we. There is nothing. Now, if you'll excuse me, I am going to enjoy my sister's wedding. And you are going to leave me alone." It was the most powerful she had ever felt in her entire life. For a glorious second, she saw shock on his face. True, unfiltered shock that she would dare to defy him so completely, so publicly. He wasn't used to being told no. And then, the shock curdled into pure rage. His face transformed. The charming mask dissolved, revealing the twisted, ugly monster beneath. His eyes went black, his lips pulled back from his teeth in a snarl. It all happened so fast. One moment she was standing tall, victorious. The next, his arm was a blur. The sound was like a firecracker exploding next to her ear, a sharp, ugly crack that seemed to suck all the air and music and laughter out of the grand ballroom. Then came the pain, a blinding, stinging heat that erupted across her left cheek. Her head snapped to the side from the force of it, her hair flying across her face. The world went silent. Utterly, completely silent. In that deafening void, all she could hear was the frantic pounding of her own heart. The pain on her cheek was already fading, replaced by a different kind of heat, the burn of absolute, soul-deep humiliation. It was the piazza all over again, but 1,000 times worse. This wasn't just a crowd of strangers. This was her family, her friends, her sister. A choked sob caught in her throat. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, feel their pity, their shock, their judgment. She was a spectacle, a victim, the very thing she had sworn she would never be again. She slowly, so slowly, lifted her head, her vision blurry with unshed tears of rage. She looked at Marco, who was breathing heavily, his chest puffed out, a triumphant sneer already forming on his face. He had won. He had put her back in her place. But then she saw something over his shoulder, a change in the landscape of the room. A path was clearing through the frozen crowd, and a man was moving down that path. A tall, dark figure of impossible stillness and menace. His face was a mask of cold fury. His eyes were not black with rage like Marco's. They were dark voids that promised nothing but oblivion. And they were fixed on the man who had just struck her.
Alessandro saw the precise moment the switch was flipped. He saw the defiance in Isabella's voice ignite the fuse in Marco Bianchi's pathetic excuse for a soul. He saw her yank her arm away, and a dark, dangerous thrill went through him. "Yes," a voice in his head growled. "Fight him." He had been about to intervene, to put an end to the confrontation himself, but seeing her stand up for herself, seeing that fire blaze to life, it was magnificent. He held back, giving her that space, that moment of power. Then he saw Bianchi's expression shift from shock to feral rage. Time seemed to slow down, the golden light of the ballroom thickening like honey. Alessandro's body tensed, every muscle coiling, ready to spring. He was already moving before Bianchi's hand had even completed its arc. The sound of the slap was an obscenity. It was a physical violation not just of her, but of a fundamental rule in Alessandro's universe. It was an act of profound disrespect committed in his presence against someone he had claimed. The rational part of his brain, the cold, calculating Don, ceased to exist. All that was left was the primal, territorial male. The man whose mother had been murdered because his father had not been there to protect her. A failure he had sworn on his own life he would never repeat. He didn't run. He moved with a speed that was both terrifying and graceful. The crowd of stunned guests melted away from him, their bodies registering the lethal intent rolling off him in palpable waves. He didn't see their faces. He didn't hear their gasps. His entire world had narrowed to two people, the woman with the blazing red mark on her cheek, and the dead man who had put it there. He didn't touch Marco. He didn't need to. He simply arrived, his larger frame eclipsing him, his shadow falling over him like a shroud. He stopped directly in front of him, close enough to feel the panicked radiation of his body heat. Marco stumbled back a step, his triumphant sneer dissolving into a mask of confusion and dawning fear as he finally registered who was standing before him. The name De Luca was a prayer and a curse in Naples, and the recognition was a fresh wave of terror in his eyes. Alessandro ignored him. For a moment, his entire focus was on Isabella. Her eyes were wide, glistening with tears she refused to let fall. The mark on her skin was a brand of shame that he felt as if it were his own, but beneath the shock, beneath the pain, he saw it. An unbroken core of pure, fiery defiance. She was not wilting. She was smoldering, ready to burn the whole world down, and that untamed spirit called to the darkest parts of his soul. He slowly turned his head, his gaze finally settling on Marco Bianchi. He let the silence stretch, let the fear marinate. He watched the man's bravado crumble, watched him shrink under the weight of his silent regard. Alessandro didn't need to raise his voice. His power wasn't in volume. It was in the absolute certainty of the violence he could unleash. When he finally spoke, his voice was unnaturally calm, a soft, deadly whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent, cavernous hall. "Don't touch her again." The words were not a warning. They were a judgment. A sentence passed. Marco paled, a sickly greenish tint under his skin. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, no sound coming out. He was a clown who had just realized the lion whose tail he'd been twisting was very, very real. Then Alessandro did the only thing that mattered. He broke his stare down with the insect in front of him and looked back at Isabella. He held her gaze, letting her see the cold fury he held on a tight leash for her sake. He was showing her his power, not to intimidate her but to offer it to her. A shield, a sword. In his dark, dangerous eyes, she wasn't a victim to be pitied. She was a queen whose honor had just been defended. And in that silent, charged moment, with the entire Neapolitan society as their witness, a dangerous and irrevocable line was drawn, tying their two worlds together forever.
The spell shattered. The charged silence between her and the dark stranger was broken by a frantic cry. "Isabella!" Her father and Sophia rushed toward her, their faces masks of horror and concern. The ballroom exploded into a roar of whispers, 100 hushed, excited conversations igniting at once. Her sister's perfect wedding had been ruined, turned into a scene, a piece of scandalous gossip that would be whispered over espressos for weeks. And she was at the center of it all. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. Sophia reached her first, her hands fluttering over Isabella's cheek, her eyes wide with tears. Mio Dio, are you hurt? Who was that? Papa, call the carabinieri. Her father looked from her to Marco, who was being helped up by a friend, his face a mess of terror and fury. Then he looked at the stranger who stood beside her like a granite statue. Her father's eyes widened, a flicker of something beyond shock in them, recognition and fear. Before she could process it, before she could answer her sister's frantic questions, the stranger moved. His hand came to rest on the small of her back. It wasn't a grab, not like Marco's bruising grip. It was a touch of immense, unshakable pressure, a silent command. It was shockingly warm, a point of heat that seemed to burn right through the fabric of her dress. "We're leaving," he said. The words were not for her father or her sister. They were for her, but they weren't a question. It was a statement of fact. "Wait, who are you?" her father stammered, taking a step forward. The stranger didn't even look at him. His dark eyes were locked on hers, holding her captive. "This discussion is over." He began to guide her away from the center of the storm he had created. And for some reason, she went. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else as he steered her through the parting crowd. Every eye was on them. She could feel their stares like tiny pinpricks on her skin. She should be fighting, screaming, pulling away. But she was too stunned, too caught in the gravitational pull of the man beside her. There was a terrifying sort of peace in his control, a relief in not having to make a decision. He was a force of nature, and she was just a leaf caught in his current. He led her through the chaotic ballroom, past the string quartet that had fallen silent, and out a set of tall glass doors onto a secluded terrace. The night air was cool and smelled of salt and night-blooming jasmine. The chaotic noise of the party faded, replaced by the gentle rhythm of waves washing against the cliffs below. The moon hung full and white in the sky, casting a silver path across the dark water. It was painfully beautiful, a stark contrast to the ugly scene she'd just escaped. He finally released her, stepping back to put a few feet of space between them. In the moonlight, he looked even more intimidating. He was all sharp angles and deep shadows, his tailored suit unable to hide the raw power in his frame. The shock finally began to recede, and the anger that Marco had ignited roared back to life, now directed at this new, more dangerous man. "Who do you think you are?" she demanded, her voice shaking but firm. "You can't just manhandle me, drag me out here. Who are you?" "I'm the man who just stopped him from hitting you again," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly timbre that vibrated through the quiet air. "I didn't need your help." The lie tasted bitter in her mouth, but she had to say it. "I had it under control." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a humorless, knowing expression. "Did you?" The simple question infuriated her because she knew the answer. "Why did you do it? Do you know Marco?" "I know his type," he said, his gaze intense. "A coward who preys on women to feel powerful. A man like that, shamed in front of his entire world, does not just forget. He retaliates. He is more dangerous to you now than he was 5 minutes ago." A chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze crept over her skin. He was right. Marco's ego was a fragile, violent thing, humiliating him so publicly. What would he do to get revenge? "You need protection," the stranger stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And just like that, her fear was consumed by a different kind of fury. Protection, a gilded cage, a stronger master. "Protection?" she scoffed, the sound incredulous. "From you? Is that what this is? Some kind of test? You play the hero, so I'll come running to you for help?" She took a step toward him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. I spent the last 5 years of my life learning how to protect myself. I got out of one cage. I am not about to voluntarily walk into another one. I don't need a keeper. I don't need you. She expected him to get angry, to lash out. But he just watched her, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her defiant words to the terror hiding underneath. That was almost worse. He wasn't angry. He was studying her. I appreciate whatever that was, she said, gesturing vaguely back toward the ballroom. But I can take care of myself. Stay away from me, and stay away from my family. Without waiting for a reply, she turned on her heel and stormed back toward the light and noise of the party, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was terrified, and she was attracted to him, and the combination was the most dangerous thing she had ever felt.
Alessandro watched her walk away, the moonlight catching the defiant line of her shoulders. Her dress, a deep sapphire blue, shimmered as she moved, making her look like a piece of the night sky that had fallen to earth. He had never, in his entire adult life, been spoken to in such a way. Men who held far more power than her father trembled in his presence. Rivals plotted his death in hushed whispers. But this woman had looked him in the eye and told him to stay away. She had dismissed him. And God help him, it was the most captivating thing he had ever witnessed. Frustration warred with a dark, unfamiliar surge of admiration. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a fighter. She had a core of tempered steel that Marco Bianchi had been too stupid to see, and that Alessandro was, he admitted to himself, utterly fascinated by. He turned his gaze to the sea, the silver path on the water doing nothing to soothe the storm inside him. What had he done? He had shattered a lifetime of discipline for a woman he barely knew. He had acted on pure, raw instinct, on an emotion he hadn't felt since he was a boy. He had made a spectacle of himself, of her. He had publicly drawn a line in the sand, placing Isabella Romano squarely under the banner of his protection in the eyes of everyone who mattered in Naples. It was a catastrophic misstep. It was a declaration, and it had painted a target on her back larger than the moon hanging in the sky. His enemies, men like Riccardo Gallo, looked for one thing: weakness, a vulnerability to exploit, and he had just handed it to them on a silver platter. The soft scrape of leather on stone announced Luca's arrival. His consigliere stepped onto the terrace, his face impassive, but Alessandro could read the deep concern in the man's eyes. "The car is ready, boss," Luca said quietly. "Signore Romano is agitated. He's demanding to know who you are." "Let him demand," Alessandro said, his voice hard. "Our business with him is finished for tonight. His daughter is another matter." He finally turned from the sea, his decision made. Her rejection meant nothing. It was the frightened, proud lashing out of a woman who didn't understand the world she had just stepped into. He would not allow her pride to get her killed. "She refused your help?" Luca asked, though he already knew the answer. "She has fire," Alessandro said, a grim smile touching his lips. "I won't let men like Bianchi snuff it out." He straightened his tie, the simple action a recentering of his control. The emotional lapse was over. Now, the strategist took over. "Have 2 of our best men watch her. I want them to be shadows. She is not to know they are there, but I want to know where she is, who she speaks to, what she eats for breakfast. Understood?" "Understood, boss." "And get me everything there is on Marco Bianchi," Alessandro continued, his voice dropping to a lethal cold. "I want to know who his family is, what businesses he's in, who he owes money to, who he answers to. I want to know which of his associates will cry at his funeral, and which will send me a bottle of champagne." Luca nodded once. "It will be done." Alessandro's mind was already 5 steps ahead. The situation was a mess, but it was a mess of his own making, and he would control it. He would protect her, whether she wanted him to or not. It was no longer a choice. It was a matter of honor. His honor. The image of her face, flushed with anger and fear in the moonlight, burned in his mind. The feeling of her in his arms, the slight tremor running through her as he guided her away, it had awakened something in him. A possessive, dangerous instinct that he knew with chilling certainty would lead to nothing but chaos. The game had changed. And he was no longer just playing for power. He was playing for her.
The week after the wedding was a masterclass in suffocating silence. Sophia and her new husband left for their honeymoon in Positano, escaping the cloud of scandal that had descended upon the family. But for Isabella and her parents, there was no escape. The air in their beautiful, sun-drenched home grew thick with unspoken words. Her mother would start to ask about the incident, only to have her father cut her off with a sharp look. Whispers followed Isabella if she dared to go to the local market. She felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of her own life, the faint, phantom sting of Marco's slap a constant reminder of the chaos she had brought down upon them all. Then, the attacks began. They weren't loud or violent. They were quiet, insidious, and aimed right at the heart of her family, their small, struggling boutique in the heart of Naples. First, the delivery of silk from Como, from a supplier her father had worked with for 20 years, was inexplicably canceled. The supplier gave a flimsy excuse about a loom malfunction, but her father's pale, drawn face told her it was a lie. A few days later, a vicious, anonymous review appeared on a popular Naples fashion blog, calling their shop's designs dated and shoddy, and accusing them of passing off cheap materials as luxury goods. The post went viral. It was a lie, a cruel and targeted piece of slander, but the damage was immediate. Customers canceled appointments. The phone stopped ringing. Isabella knew who was behind it. This was Marco's style. It was the piazza all over again, a slow, public execution of their reputation. He wouldn't dare touch her, not after the stranger's terrifying warning. So instead, he was strangling her family, cutting off their air supply, and making her watch. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon. Isabella was in the shop, helping her mother fold unsold scarves, the silence between them as heavy as the bolts of velvet in the back room. The bell over the door chimed, but the two men who entered were not customers. They were large, broad-shouldered men in cheap suits that couldn't conceal the bulk of their muscles. They didn't browse. They stood in the middle of the shop, their presence sucking the warmth out of the room. One of them, a man with a scarred face and dead eyes, smiled at her mother. It was the most frightening smile Isabella had ever seen. "Signora Romano," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Just a friendly reminder. Signore Valli is expecting this month's payment, with interest." Her mother shrank back, her hand flying to her throat. "Of course," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My husband. He is handling it." "See that he does," the man said. His eyes flicked to Isabella, cold and dismissive, before he and his partner turned and left. That night, Isabella waited until her mother was asleep. She found her father in his study, staring at a mountain of unpaid bills, his face as gray as ash. She closed the door behind her. "Who is Signore Valli?" she asked, her voice quiet but unyielding. Her father flinched, not even looking at her. "It's business, Isabella. You don't need to worry." "Don't lie to me." The words ripped out of her, raw with a week's worth of fear and guilt. "Those men today, the canceled delivery, the review. This is all because of me, isn't it? It's because of what happened at the wedding." The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once. His broad shoulders slumped, and he finally looked at her, his eyes swimming with a shame so profound it made her heart ache. "No, cara mia," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's not because of you. It's because of me." And then it all came pouring out. The boutique wasn't just struggling. It was a sinking ship. He had made bad investments, tried to expand too quickly, and had fallen into debt. Deep, terrifying debt. To keep them from losing everything, he had taken a loan. Not from a bank, but from a private lender. A loan shark, Signore Valli. The interest rates were criminal, the payments impossible to meet. He was on the verge of losing the shop, their home, everything. I don't understand, Isabella stammered, sinking into the chair opposite his desk. Then why are they pressuring us so hard now? Her father buried his face in his hands. I don't know, he choked out. Valley was manageable. But since the wedding, it's like a switch was flipped. He's demanding everything all at once. It's like that incident put a target on our backs. The truth settled over her, cold and heavy as a burial shroud. Her father's ruin, her family's terror. It was her fault. Her defiance of Marco had brought this new, more dangerous attention down on them. She had tried to be strong, and in doing so, she had handed her family's enemies a sword to hold to their throats.
Alessandro studied the file on his desk. The report from Luca was, as always, brutally efficient. Marco Bianchi was exactly what he'd appeared to be, a vain, small-time parasite with an inflated sense of importance. But there were two details that made Alessandro's blood run cold. First, Bianchi had recently been seen several times in the company of Riccardo Gallo's men. Second, the loan shark squeezing Isabella's father, a man named Enzo Valli, was one of Gallo's chief enforcers. The pieces clicked into place with the chilling finality of a prison door locking. This was never about Marco's bruised ego. It was a calculated attack. Gallo, his most cunning and ruthless rival, had been watching. He had seen the public spectacle at the wedding. He had seen Alessandro, a man known for his icy control, act with raw, protective fury over a woman. And like the serpent he was, he had identified a weakness. He was using Bianchi as a disposable pawn and Valli as a hammer to shatter the Romano family, all to see how Alessandro would react. It was a test, a trap, and Isabella was the bait. A cold rage, far more dangerous than the hot anger he'd felt at the wedding, settled deep in his bones. He had done this. His one moment of emotional indulgence had put her and her entire family directly in the path of a monster. He read the other report, the one from the shadows he'd placed on her. It detailed the sabotage at the boutique and most recently the visit from Valli's thugs. She was living in a nightmare, and worse, she believed it was all her fault. He knew she did. He could imagine the guilt she must be carrying, a weight he had placed on her shoulders. He couldn't protect her from a distance anymore, not when the enemy wasn't a simple bully but a master strategist like Gallo. She was walking through a minefield, thinking she was only trying to avoid puddles. She needed to know the truth, the whole, ugly, terrifying truth. He sent a simple, untraceable text message from a burner phone. Piazza Bellini, the cafe with the green awning. 1 hour. Come alone. He knew she wouldn't want to come, but he also knew she was desperate. He had the answers she needed. She arrived exactly 1 hour later, her face pale, her eyes dark with suspicion and exhaustion. He had secured the small cafe, his men discreetly ensuring no one else could get close. She stopped at his table, refusing to sit. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice brittle. "If this is another offer of protection, you can save your breath." "This isn't an offer," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's a warning. Please, sit." She hesitated, then reluctantly slid into the chair opposite him. He didn't waste time. He laid it all out for her. Marco's connection to Riccardo Gallo, the fact that Valli the loan shark worked for Gallo, the reality that this was a coordinated attack. He watched her absorb the information, watched her suspicion morph into confusion and dawning horror. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would this Gallo person do this to my family? We're nothing to him." Alessandro leaned forward, and this was it, the point of no return, the revelation that would either bind them together or shatter any hope of trust forever. "He isn't doing this because of your family, Isabella. He's doing it because of me." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "You? The man you think I am. A gangster, a man like Valli." "That's not the entire picture," he said, choosing his words with surgical precision. "Valli is a loan shark. He preys on desperation. I am the head of the De Luca family. We are different. We have rules. A code. Your father's debt was not with a man like Valley. It was with me. Her eyes widened in shock. You're the one he owes money to? The betrayal and disgust in her voice was a physical blow. No, Alessandro said, shaking his head. That's the part you don't understand. I was at your sister's wedding to finalize an old arrangement. A debt your grandfather incurred with my father years ago. A debt I was there to forgive. She just stared at him, her mind reeling. Forgive? Why? Because your family has history in this city. Because it was the honorable thing to do. I was wiping his slate clean, Isabella. For good. He let that sink in before he delivered the final devastating truth. Gallo saw me at the wedding. He saw what happened between you and Bianchi. He saw me defend you. And he saw a weakness, a pressure point. He is squeezing your father through Valley to get to you. And he is using you to get to me. My one act to protect you that night has made you the single biggest target in my world.
The world tilted on its axis. The quiet cafe, the scent of espresso, the gentle clink of a spoon against ceramic, it all faded into a dull, meaningless hum. The words echoed in the sudden silence of her mind. I was there to forgive the debt. He is using you to get to me. Everything she thought she knew was a lie. The narrative she had constructed in her head, with its clear villain and reluctant hero, had been torn to shreds. Alessandro De Luca wasn't the predator. He was the shield. And his attempt to protect her had painted a target on her back so large it had engulfed her entire family. The weight of it was crushing, a physical pressure on her chest that made it impossible to breathe. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a cold-blooded mafioso, but a man caught in a cage of his own making, a cage he had inadvertently dragged her into. Before a single word could form on her lips, a sharp buzz vibrated from the phone he'd placed on the table. He glanced at the screen, and the formidable calm he wore like a suit of armor instantly vaporized. A stark, terrible expression seized his features, his jaw tightening so hard a muscle jumped. He looked up at her, and the look in his eyes, it was a black hole of dread that pulled her in. "What is it?" she whispered, her own fear rising to meet his. His voice was a raw, guttural sound, stripped of all its earlier control. "It's Luca. They were sloppy. Sophia and her husband just landed at the airport. They never made it to their car." He took a harsh, unsteady breath. "Gallo has your sister." No. The word was a silent scream in her soul. Not Sophia. Not her innocent, happy sister who knew nothing of this darkness, who had just started her new life. The cafe floor seemed to drop away from beneath her feet. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over her. This couldn't be real. It was a nightmare, a horrible, waking nightmare. And it was her fault. The guilt was a physical thing, a toxic flood that drowned out every other thought, every other feeling. If she had never come back to Naples, if she had just ignored Marco at the wedding, if she had never looked into this man's dark, compelling eyes, Sophia would be home, laughing about her honeymoon, safe. The grief and terror inside her needed somewhere to go, a target to hit. It found one in the man sitting opposite her, the architect of this entire disaster. "You!" The word was a choked, venomous hiss. She scrambled to her feet, the chair clattering backward onto the stone floor. "This is your fault, your world, your disgusting, violent games and your blood money. You and your code." She spat the word like it was poison. "Isabella?" He started, standing up, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Don't!" she shrieked, backing away from him as if he were on fire. "Don't you say my name. You said you would protect me. You swore it. And now my sister who has done nothing to anyone, is gone. Your protection is a curse. It's a death sentence." Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and furious. She didn't want his logic. She didn't want his help. She wanted to hurt him. She wanted him to feel even a fraction of the agony that was tearing her apart. "Stay away from me," she sobbed, her voice breaking. Stay away from what's left of my family. I never want to see you again." She turned and ran. She fled the cafe, fled the piazza, fled the sight of his tormented face. She didn't know where she was going. She just ran until her lungs burned and the world was a blurry mess of tears and motion. Hours later, the official demand came. A text to her father's phone. No police. A single photo of Sophia, blindfolded and terrified. And a demand. Not for money. For something far worse. Gallo wanted Alessandro to cede control of the port operations in Pozzuoli, a move that would cripple the De Luca family and be seen as an act of utter surrender. It was an impossible demand, a declaration of war disguised as a ransom. Despair settled over her home like a physical plague. Her mother was sedated, her father a broken shell of a man. The situation was hopeless. Alessandro and his world had caused this, and they were powerless to fix it without getting Sophia killed. That's when the desperate, reckless idea began to form in her mind. This started with her. It had to end with her. They didn't want the port. Not really. They wanted leverage over Alessandro. They wanted her. She had some valuable jewelry from her grandmother, a few €1,000 saved in her account. It wasn't much, but maybe it was enough to bargain with. Maybe she could offer herself in exchange for Sophia. It was a stupid plan, a suicidal plan. But it was a plan, and it was the only thing that stopped her from drowning in guilt. While the men Alessandro had assigned to watch her were focused on the perimeter of the house, she slipped out her old bedroom window, a ghost in the night, walking blindly toward a trap she couldn't see.
The 2 words from Luca on the phone, "They have her," were like a bullet to the chest. For a frozen moment, Alessandro was no longer in a sunlit piazza in Naples. He was 15 years old again, standing in a moonlit garden, the scent of his mother's ruined roses thick in the air. He saw her lying on the grass, a beautiful broken doll, a victim of his father's war, a consequence of his father's power, a failure of his father's protection. It was the defining moment of his life, the trauma that had forged him into a creature of pure, cold control. And now, history was repeating itself. Riccardo Gallo hadn't just kidnapped a woman. He had reached into Alessandro's soul and was twisting the knife that had been lodged there for 15 years. Then came Isabella's words. "This is your fault. Your protection is a death sentence." Every accusation, every scream, was a nail hammered into his conscience. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. Because he knew in the deepest, most absolute part of his being that she was right. This was his world, his war, his failure. He had seen the light in her and had selfishly drawn it into his darkness. And in doing so, he had scorched it. Her rejection of him was absolute, her hatred a righteous fire. It was the worst pain he had ever felt, a slow, agonizing bleed that no amount of power or control could stop. He watched her run, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly, utterly alone. Back in the study of his villa, his command center, the situation was grim. Gallo's demand came through. It was brilliant in its cruelty. Ceding the port was impossible. It would be an admission of weakness so profound his entire organization would collapse within a month. His captains would see him as weak, his enemies would smell blood, and a full-scale war would erupt on the streets. But refusing the demand meant signing Sophia's death warrant. He was trapped, checkmated. Every strategic instinct, every ruthless calculation, was useless. An overt move against Gallo would get Sophia killed. Doing nothing would get her killed. He was a king with an army, and he couldn't move a single piece on the board. He stared at the maps, at the streams of intel from his informants, but saw nothing. All he could see was Isabella's face, contorted in grief and hatred. All he could hear was her voice accusing him. He had failed. The one thing he had built his entire life around, the absolute protection of what was his, had crumbled to dust. He was his father, broken and helpless in the face of an enemy's barbarism. "Boss," Luca's voice cut through his dark thoughts. He stood in the doorway, his face grim. There's a problem. At the Romano house. Alessandro's blood ran cold. What is it? Isabella. She's gone. She slipped the perimeter. She climbed out a window about 20 minutes ago. We don't know where she is. The last semblance of control Alessandro possessed shattered into a million pieces. The rage and despair he'd been holding at bay erupted, a black volcanic fury. He swept his arm across the massive oak desk, sending phones, laptops, and maps crashing to the marble floor in a cacophony of destruction. He knew. He knew exactly what she was doing. She was going to try and be the hero. She was going to trade herself, or worse, try to reason with animals who only understood violence. She was walking to her own execution out of guilt and love. The helplessness was a poison, choking him, blinding him. He had failed to protect her sister. He had driven her away with his toxic world. And now, he had lost her completely. She was out there, alone, walking into the heart of the fire. And he was trapped here, a king in a paper crown, utterly, terrifyingly powerless to stop it.
The nighttime streets of Naples were a labyrinth of shadows and secrets. Isabella moved through them like a ghost, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. In her bag, the heavy weight of her grandmother's gold necklace and the wad of euros that was her entire life's savings felt pathetically small. She was running on a cocktail of pure adrenaline, terror, and a guilt so profound it was a physical sickness in her stomach. This was her fault. She had to be the one to fix it. She followed the instructions that had been texted to her father, a derelict warehouse in the industrial port, a place that smelled of salt, rust, and decay. The massive corrugated door was slightly ajar, a dark mouth waiting to swallow her whole. Taking a breath that did nothing to calm her shaking body, she slipped inside. The space was cavernous, lit only by a few bare, swinging bulbs that cast long, dancing shadows. Her footsteps echoed unnervingly. Two men sat on overturned crates playing cards. They looked up as she entered, their expressions shifting from boredom to cruel amusement. They were the same thugs from the boutique. "Well, well," the scarred one said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Look what the cat dragged in. You lost, little girl?" "I'm here to make a deal," she said, forcing her voice to stay level. She walked forward and emptied the contents of her bag onto a dusty table. The jewelry and cash looked like a child's playthings in the grim, industrial space. "This is all I have. Let my sister go. Please, take me instead. I'm the one you want." Both men erupted in laughter, a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the high metal ceiling. "You?" the other one sneered. "You think you get to make the deals? You're nothing. You're just the bait. Your sister is insurance. Now, the boss might want to have a chat with you." He took a step toward her, reaching out to grab her arm. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. Her plan was not just foolish, it was suicidal. But then, a phone rang. Its cheerful, tinny ringtone, a bizarre intrusion in the tense standoff. The scarred man grunted in annoyance and answered it, turning away from her slightly. His voice was a low growl of frustration. "What?" He snapped into the phone. A pause. "No, we can't move her yet. Are you insane? Not until the shipment from Casino is secured at the villa. Gallo will have our heads if anything spooks the buyers. Yes, the old vineyard estate. Just get it done." The words meant nothing to her. Casino, a villa, a shipment. It was the meaningless jargon of their violent world. But the call was a gift, a sliver of an opening. While the scarred man was distracted and his partner was watching him, Isabella acted on pure instinct. Her eyes darted around, landing on a stack of heavy, rusted metal barrels leaning precariously against a support beam. With a desperate cry, she shoved against the closest one with all her might. It toppled with a deafening, groaning crash, triggering a chain reaction. The other barrels fell like dominoes, creating a thunderous, chaotic avalanche of metal that plunged their corner of the warehouse into sudden, absolute darkness as the last swinging light bulb was shattered. She didn't wait. She bolted. She ran blindly into the shadows, her lungs burning, her only guide the angry, confused shouts of the men behind her. A hand swiped at her shoulder, catching the fabric of her jacket, but she ripped herself free and scrambled through the open door, back into the cool night air. She ran without direction, her only thought to put as much distance as possible between herself and that place. After what felt like an eternity, she finally collapsed in a deserted alleyway, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. Her plan had been a disaster. She was a fool. She had almost gotten herself killed or captured, and she was no closer to saving Sophia. The ugly truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. She couldn't do this alone. Her pride, her anger, her guilt, it was all worthless. It was all endangering her sister. There was only one person in the world who could fix this. Swallowing the bitter taste of her own failure, she pushed herself to her feet. There was no other choice. She had to go back to him. She had to trust him.
The wreckage of his study was a perfect reflection of the chaos in his soul. Alessandro stood amidst the shattered phones and scattered papers, a caged animal who had finally ripped his own cage apart. The rage had passed, leaving behind a cold, terrifying hollowness. He had failed. He had lost her. "Anything?" he demanded, his voice a raw rasp. Luca, standing calmly in the doorway, the single point of order in the room, shook his head. "My men are sweeping the port district. The watch on the Romano house is being questioned." "Nothing yet, boss." Every second that ticked by was a new form of torture. He imagined her in Gallo's hands. He imagined her fear. He imagined her paying the price for his mistakes. The self-loathing was a poison, thick and black in his veins. He had pushed her away with his darkness, and she had run straight into the arms of a greater one. He was no better than his father, powerful, feared, and ultimately unable to protect the one thing that mattered. "Sir?" A guard's voice, hesitant and nervous, came from the intercom. "There is a woman at the main gate. It's Signorina Romano. She is alone. She asks to see you." The words were a defibrillator to his dying hope, a jolt of pure, unadulterated relief so powerful it buckled his knees. She was alive. She was safe. She had come back. He met her in the grand foyer. The sight of her stole the breath from his lungs. She was a mess. Her clothes were torn, there was a smear of dirt on her face, and a nasty scrape on her hand was bleeding sluggishly. But her eyes were no longer filled with hatred or despair. They were clear, blazing with a fierce, desperate determination that mirrored his own. The chasm of anger and blame that had opened up between them in the cafe was gone, erased by the shared terror of the last few hours. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "I was so stupid. I went to them. I tried to bargain." He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders, his touch both a reassurance that she was real and a desperate plea for her to never do that again. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "No. I got away. Alessandro, I heard something." She looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. One of the men was on the phone. He was angry. He said they couldn't move Sophia yet. He said, "Not until the shipment from Casino is secured at the villa, the old vineyard estate." The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. Casino, the old Gallo vineyard estate. For months he had been hearing whispers of Gallo moving into weapons smuggling, using a route through Casino. The vineyard estate was a known Gallo property, but it was thought to be abandoned, a relic. It was a fortress he'd never been able to penetrate. Gallo wasn't just holding Sophia there as a hostage. He was in the middle of a massive arms deal. He was exposed. He was vulnerable. The fool was using a kidnapping to distract from a multi-million-euro transaction. Isabella hadn't just escaped. She had brought him the key, the one impossible piece of information he needed to bring the entire board crashing down on Gallo's head. The despair that had been choking him for hours was burned away by a sudden, brilliant surge of hope. He looked down at her, at this incredible, brave, reckless woman, and was filled with a raw, profound awe. He gently took her scraped hand, his thumb brushing away a smudge of dirt. "You were not stupid," he said, his voice hoarse. "You were brave, and you just gave us the way in." He led her to a sitting room, his touch gentle as he cleaned and bandaged her hand. It was a quiet, intimate moment that shattered the last of the walls between them. She had seen the monster in him, and she had still come back. He had seen her at her most broken, and she had emerged with a strength that humbled him. The fire of purpose returned to him, hotter and more focused than ever before. He was no longer a helpless king. He was a hunter, and she had just shown him where his prey was hiding. He began issuing a rapid-fire series of commands to Luca, his mind a whirlwind of strategy and logistics. Men were mobilized, plans were drawn. A war was about to begin. When he was done, he turned back to Isabella. She was watching him, her expression a mixture of fear and a fragile, burgeoning trust. He went to her, taking her bandaged hand in his. Their shared crisis had forged a bond between them that was stronger than steel. "Stay with me," he said, his voice a low, earnest plea. "Don't leave my side." She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. She gave a single, determined nod. "Okay." "We're going to get her back," he promised, his voice resonating with absolute certainty. "Together."
The study in Alessandro's villa had transformed from a place of despair into a military command center. Maps of the old Gallo Vineyard estate were spread across the massive oak desk, and Alessandro moved around it with the focused intensity of a master chess player planning his final, decisive move. He was no longer the tormented man from the cafe. He was a general on the eve of battle, and his quiet, lethal confidence was both terrifying and intoxicating. He was briefing his most trusted men, his voice low and precise, but he kept glancing at her. She wasn't an outsider. He was including her. "The main gate is a death trap," he said, tapping a point on the map. "And their surveillance here, along the western wall, is comprehensive. But they won't be expecting an approach from the north slope. It's steep, overgrown. There's a service tunnel," Isabella heard herself say. The men all turned to look at her. A year ago, the attention would have made her shrink. Now she met their gazes. "My father's boutique catered a charity event there years ago. I remember the staff complaining about it. It was used for bringing in supplies from a back road. The entrance is hidden in an old stone grotto covered in ivy." She walked to the table and pointed to a spot on the map that was blank. "It should be right about here." Alessandro looked from her finger to her face, a slow, dark fire of admiration in his eyes. He gave a sharp nod. "That's our way in." Hours later, she was crouched beside him in the damp, earthy darkness of that very tunnel. She wasn't safe in a car miles away. He had insisted she stay with him with Luca at their side. "You are the key to this," he had said. "I'm not letting you out of my sight." The words should have felt possessive, controlling. Instead, they felt like a vow. The assault was nothing like the chaotic violence she imagined. It was silent, swift, and brutally efficient. Alessandro's men moved like shadows, disabling guards with a terrifying economy of motion. Gunshots were few, suppressed to dull coughs in the night. Alessandro was at the forefront, not a reckless brawler, but a phantom of focused violence. He moved with a grace that was utterly lethal, his every action precise. They emerged from the tunnel into a manicured courtyard. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, the adrenaline a sharp metallic taste in her mouth. And then she saw him. Marco. He wasn't a confident predator here. He was just a man with a gun, looking terrified and out of his depth as the raid unfolded around him. His eyes widened when he saw her, and a flicker of his old, ugly possessiveness flared. "Isabella!" he shouted, raising his weapon, a pathetic attempt to regain some semblance of control. Alessandro moved to step in front of her to shield her, but she put a hand on his arm, stopping him. This was her fight, her ghost to exorcise. She stepped forward, her gaze unwavering, feeling none of the fear he used to inspire in her. All she felt was a cold, clear pity. "Put the gun down, Marco," she said, her voice calm. "It's over." "You did this," he accused, his voice cracking. "You brought this monster into our lives." "You're the one who deals with monsters, Marco," she replied, her voice dropping, each word a carefully placed stone. "You align yourself with men like Gallo. You prey on people you think are weaker than you. But you were wrong about me." She took another step, and he actually flinched. "You were always nothing. A small, pathetic bully who needed to make others feel weak to feel like a man. Look at you. You're terrified. You're disposable. And you are nothing to me." She held his gaze for a final, contemptuous second, then turned her back on him, dismissing him from her life as easily as brushing away a piece of lint. She walked back to Alessandro's side, leaving Marco to be silently and efficiently disarmed by two of Alessandro's men. He was no longer a demon from her past, he was just a sad, irrelevant story, and she had just written the final chapter.
The familiar, cold calm of battle had settled over him. Every sense was heightened. He could smell the cordite in the air, feel the vibration of movement through the soles of his shoes, see every shadow as a potential threat. His men moved with the discipline he had drilled into them, a pack of wolves flowing through the estate, their loyalty to him absolute. He was in his element. But this time was different. Every few seconds his eyes would flick to Isabella. She was right there, in the heart of the chaos, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a courage that stunned him. His protective instincts were a roaring fire in his gut, a constant primal urge to wrap her in his arms and spirit her away. But he had to trust her. He had to honor the strength she had shown him. When she faced down Bianchi, he had felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost staggered him. She had not needed his protection. She had saved herself. A voice crackled in his earpiece. "Boss, we have her. North wing, second floor. Gallo's office. He has her with him. The final objective." "Luca, with me," he commanded. "The rest of you, secure the perimeter. No one gets in or out." He took Isabella's hand, his grip firm. "Stay close." She squeezed back, her message clear. Always. They moved through the opulent villa, the sounds of the silenced assault fading behind them. They reached the heavy oak doors of Gallo's office and kicked them open. The scene inside was a tableau of desperation. Riccardo Gallo stood behind his massive desk, his face a mask of sweating rage. He had one arm wrapped around Sophia's throat, the barrel of a silver pistol pressed to her temple. Sophia was sobbing, her eyes wide with terror. "De Luca," Gallo snarled. "One more step and she dies, I swear it." Alessandro came to a halt, holding up a hand to stop Luca and Isabella. He met Gallo's frantic gaze, his own expression one of utter, chilling calm. "It's over, Riccardo. Let her go." "It's not over," Gallo screamed, his voice strained. "I'm still in control here. You will give me the port or I will kill her and then I will kill her sister right in front of you." As if on cue, two of Gallo's remaining men dragged a struggling, terrified Marco into the room. Isabella gasped, but Alessandro's eyes never left Gallo. He ignored the gun. He ignored the threat. He began to dismantle the man's world with words. "You're right, you are in control of this room," Alessandro said, his voice deceptively reasonable. "But you've lost everything else. You were so focused on my supposed weakness that you never protected your own." He allowed himself a cold, thin smile. "That shipment from Casino? The buyers were very impressed with the product. My men send their thanks." Gallo's face went white. What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the arms dealers who are, as we speak, being arrested by the Carabinieri at the port you wanted so badly. I'm talking about the 10 million euros in bearer bonds they paid for the weapons you no longer have. Your entire operation, Riccardo. Gone. All because you were distracted by a girl." Gallo's face contorted in disbelief and fury. This was the moment, the tipping point. "Marco!" he shrieked, his eyes wild. "Kill her! Kill the sister!" Marco, held between two guards, looked from Gallo's insane face to Isabella's steady gaze, then to Alessandro. He was a rat on a sinking ship, looking for a life raft. "He's going to kill you anyway, Marco," Alessandro said, his voice flat. "You're a loose end." In that split second of hesitation, as Marco's pathetic mind tried to calculate the odds, Luca moved. He was a blur, disarming the guard closest to Sofia. At the same instant, Alessandro lunged across the desk. Gallo fired a wild shot that shattered a painting on the wall as Alessandro slammed into him, sending them both crashing to the floor. Isabella didn't hesitate. She rushed forward, grabbing her stunned sister and pulling her back toward the door, shielding her with her own body. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. Alessandro was stronger, faster, and fueled by a righteous fury. He disarmed Gallo, landing a single precise blow that left his rival gasping on the floor, beaten. Alessandro rose, standing over him, his chest heaving. He could end it. He could kill him right here. But he looked at Isabella, holding her sister, and knew that wasn't the way. "My family doesn't make martyrs," Alessandro growled, his voice low. He gestured to Gallo's remaining, now terrified men. "He lost you everything, your money, your freedom. He's your problem now." He turned his back on the defeated man, leaving him to the savage justice of his own betrayed crew. He walked over to Isabella, his eyes softening as they met hers. The threat was over. Sofia was safe. Without a word, he pulled Isabella into his arms, holding her in a fierce, protective embrace. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her scent, the chaos of the world outside fading away until there was only the steady, grounding beat of her heart against his. It was the feeling of victory, of relief, and of coming home.
The world came back into focus slowly. The echo of the gunshot, the smell of cordite, the memory of her sister's terrified sobs. It all receded, replaced by the solid, grounding reality of Alessandro's arms around her. She was pressed against his chest, her ear against the fine wool of his suit, and beneath it she could hear the steady, strong beat of his heart. It was the most reassuring sound she had ever heard. She was safe. Sofia was safe. It was over. He held her for a long moment, a silent, fierce embrace that said more than words ever could. When he finally loosened his grip, his dark eyes searched hers, full of a raw, tender concern she never thought she'd see in a man like him. The journey back to her family's home was a blur. She sat beside Alessandro in the back of his sleek, silent car, her sister, wrapped in a blanket and Luca's jacket, sleeping fitfully in the seat across from them. Isabella's hand was in Alessandro's, their fingers intertwined in a clasp that felt as unbreakable as a vow. The city lights of Naples streamed past the window, no longer ghosts of a painful past, but shimmering promises of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. For the first time since she'd come home, she felt a profound sense of peace. When the car pulled up to her house, her parents were already on the doorstep, their faces aged by a week of sleepless terror. The reunion was a torrent of emotion. Her mother clutched Sofia, weeping with a relief so profound it was painful to watch. Her father, his face streaked with tears, simply held his two daughters, his body trembling. After the initial wave of emotion passed, her father turned to Alessandro, who had been standing back, a silent, watchful guardian. My father, who had been so terrified of this man, now looked at him with an expression of pure, humbled gratitude. "Signore De Luca," he began, his voice thick and unsteady. "There are no words. I have no way to thank you. You saved my daughter. You saved my family. I am forever in your debt." "There is no debt, Signore Romano," Alessandro replied, his voice soft but firm. "Your family is safe. That is all that matters." Her father then turned to her. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing away her tears. "And you, mia cara," he said, his voice cracking. "My brave girl. I am so sorry. For my pride, my secrets, my weakness, I was so busy trying to hide my failures. I didn't see the incredible strength you had found all on your own. I am so, so proud of you, Isabella." In his words, she felt the final, healing stitch being sewn into the old wounds of her past. She was no longer a disappointment or a problem to be managed. She was his daughter, and he was proud of her. She looked over her father's shoulder at Alessandro, who watched them with a quiet, gentle expression. He wasn't an intruder or a monster. He was the man who had seen her strength when she couldn't see it herself, and who had given her back her family, whole and safe.
A few days later, Alessandro stood in his study. The broken furniture had been replaced, the shattered glass swept away. The large window was open, and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of salt and lemon groves drifted in, cleansing the last remnants of violence from the room. His world, which had been teetering on the brink of chaos, was quiet again. Luca stood before him, delivering a final report. Gallo's organization is eating itself alive. His lieutenants are at war over the scraps of his empire. He is no longer a threat to anyone. As for Bianchi, Luca paused, a flicker of distaste in his eyes. He has been persuaded to take a permanent vacation, a one-way ticket to a very cold, very remote place where he won't bother anyone ever again. Good, Alessandro said. All the loose ends were tied. The anonymous investment he'd funneled to the Romano boutique through a third party had been accepted, securing their financial future. His world was back in order. His enemies were vanquished. His power was absolute, and he had never felt so hollow. The victory was meaningless. The silence in his grand, empty villa was deafening. He had secured his kingdom, but what was a kingdom without a queen? With the danger gone, he knew Isabella had no reason to stay. She could go back to her safe, quiet life in Milan, a life free from the shadows that would always cling to him. And he knew, with a certainty that terrified him more than any rival's threat, that if she left, the cold, empty control he'd mistaken for a life would be all he had left. His greatest fear was no longer about losing power. It was about losing her. He found her in her family's garden, a sketchbook open on her lap. She was shaded by the leaves of an ancient olive tree, a soft smile on her face as she drew. The sight of her, so peaceful and so beautiful, made his heart ache with a fierce, desperate love. This was the life she deserved, a life of sunlight and art. What right did he have to ask her to share his darkness? She looked up as he approached, her smile widening. Alessandro. Just the way she said his name was enough to shatter his composure. He stood before her, not as the Don, not as a man of power, but simply as a man. Vulnerable. Terrified. "I came to say goodbye," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Her smile faltered. "Goodbye? Are you going somewhere?" "No," he said, his voice raw. "I came to see if you were." He took a deep breath, laying his heart at her feet, ready for her to walk away from it. "My world. It will always have shadows, Isabella. I can't change that. I can promise you that I will spend every day of my life building a world within it that is safe for you, a place where you will be cherished and protected. I swear that on my mother's soul. But you deserve a life without that fear. You deserve the sun." He looked into her beautiful, intelligent eyes. "So I am giving you a choice. The one you have earned 1,000 times over. You can go back to Milan, live your life, be free, and you will always have my protection, from a distance, a shadow you will never see. Or..." His voice broke, the final words a desperate whisper. "You can stay, with me." Isabella closed her sketchbook, a soft, thoughtful expression on her face. She rose to her feet and stepped toward him, closing the space between them. She reached up and gently touched his cheek, her touch a spark of impossible warmth. "For 5 years my life in Milan was about running away," she said, her voice soft and sure. "I was running from Marco, from Naples, from the girl I used to be. It was a life I built on fear. But these last few weeks, with you. Even in the middle of all that chaos, all that terror, I've never felt more like I was standing my ground. I've never felt more myself. She looked deep into his eyes, and he saw not fear, not doubt, but a love that mirrored his own. I'm not afraid of the shadows, Alessandro, she whispered. Not when they're your shadows. Because I know you'll always be there to lead me back to the light. She smiled, a brilliant, beautiful smile that healed every broken piece of him. I'm not running anymore. My home is here, with you. Weeks later, they stood on the private balcony of his villa, the same balcony from which he had first watched her, a sad, beautiful stranger at a party. Now, she was in his arms, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the Bay of Naples in strokes of fiery orange and soft lavender. The world was quiet. The wars were over. A new peace, one he had never known was possible, settled over him. He turned her to face him, cradling her face in his hands. He looked at this incredible woman, the woman who had faced down her past, who had walked into the fire to save her family, who had seen the monster in him and had loved him anyway. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion born from danger or of relief after a battle won. It was a kiss of profound, quiet certainty. It was the promise of 1,000 more sunsets, of a life of shared strength, of a love that was strong enough to command the darkness and gentle enough to cherish the light. It was the beginning of everything.